Welcome to Hope Blooms, a podcast from the Early Pregnancy Loss Association.
At EPLA, we seek to support women and families suffering early pregnancy loss by providing resources, education, and community. It is our vision that no one suffers miscarriage alone.
Welcome back to Hope Blooms. I'm Emily Carrington, EPLA's Executive Director.
And I'm Stephanie Gordon, the EPLA board member.
So Steph and I today are going to talk about something that has been really important to the Early Pregnancy Loss Association from the very beginning, which is identifying the financial burden of pregnancy loss.
Yes.
And so much about pregnancy loss, I think, is hidden and in isolation and sort of unknown. And we talk a lot about the physical burden and try to bring awareness to that. But I also think it's really important that we realize there's a major financial burden with miscarriage. And I found this great article, which we'll post in our comments. This was written last July, 2022. And it was titled, "No One Really Talks About Miscarriages or How Much They Cost," which both is true.
Mm-hmm.
But we do. We
Yes,
talk
we
about
do.
it all the time.
Yes.
So this article was following a woman, let me get her, Erin Schultz, through her pregnancy. And it talks about that she had a DNC and that her final out-of-pocket was $4,173. Then she had a second miscarriage, and that was even more expensive because of testing and other needs to figure out the loss of her pregnancy. But luckily, she had met the family deductible at $4,900, but it would have been way more had she let a calendar year pass.
Oof.
It would have been double, I think,
Yeah.
at least. So it goes through her story, and some of these numbers here are amazing. In this article, the average DNC bill for an uninsured woman runs about $7,000 for outpatient facility costs and $1,000 in physician fees. So this is a major. I have heard of miscarriage costs up to $9,000 and $10,000
Right.
if they include an ER visit.
Mm-hmm.
You know, some of the costs that stack up, I think what's hard too is there's not like one, like this is your miscarriage cost. Of women we've talked to and stories we've read, you can have ambulance rides, which those are not cheap.
Right.
You can have ER visits. You can have surgery, prescription costs, ultrasounds, blood work.
Mm-hmm. And then we don't talk about the emotional side effects of receiving those bills.
Right. So she says she received her bill at like a year because there was
That's crazy to me.
fight with, so more than a year later, the insurance company went back and forth with the hospital for several months after the procedure. So I only just received the final bill, Schultz says. That's so long
Yeah.
and so devastating. I know I received, so my first miscarriage, I chose to have a DNC. I remember too, like that OBGYN, I had to like make payments on my birth before during my pregnancy.
Oh my word, Emily.
I don't even know how all the money like worked out, but like I think I ended up getting reimbursed a little bit because I'd like obviously never had a birth, but I don't think I got all that back because it covered my like OBGYN fees, expenses from visits. But the morning of I went to the surgical center, which was just an outpatient surgical center with everything from like foot surgeries to miscarriages. This was down in Texas. It was a bigger town than where I live now. And I had to show up with a $500 check to get in. And
What was that for? Just like a deposit?
Surgical fees.
Okay.
Yeah, that was for, I don't know, use of the room. Because then after that, I got a bill from my surgeon and a bill from my anesthesiologist.
And were they all separate?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what those totaled. I was both young and really privileged at that point that we really hadn't had any medical distress.
Mm-hmm.
So I just sort of paid them and moved forward. Because we had a lot more in our medical savings than we do now.
Right.
But and we didn't have the other. So I'll admit, I mean, I kind of feel bad at my ignorance that first time where I was just like, well, medical things are expensive. And
Mm-hmm.
we were sort of decently insured. I don't think we had an HSA, but we were sort of okay. But we were also, I was 27. My husband was 30.
Mm-hmm.
There really wasn't a lot of medical needs or expenses.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was sort of the first time we had been met with any sort of serious medical expenses. And probably hopefully a lot of people, you know, that you're not bearing a lot of other medical expenses in your 20s. But yeah, so my first one was the more expensive loss, but also made sense. I had a DNC, like this woman. My second time, I miscarried at home, and it still cost me a few $100s.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was shocking. But doctor's visits, ultrasounds, confirmation ultrasounds.
Mm-hmm.
After I delivered everything, I came back in for, I don't know, like my fourth ultrasound of the month to make sure that everything was passed. So, you know, in some ways she says like, at least they were all in 1 year, but in other ways it's like you don't even get done paying for one before you start paying for the next.
Right. So my miscarriage, again, this was in 2012, so times were a little different. But I went to triage, and then I was in a room, and I had blood work done. I had a traditional ultrasound, then I had a transvaginal ultrasound. So I believe I paid a little over $2,000 just for that one visit to triage. And I remember doing a payment plan. So it's just terrible, you know, and I just receiving that bill, you know, several months later where you're kind of like maybe starting to get over the hump a little bit. Not really, but, you know, it's not consuming your every moment. And then you're like, oh, so now we have this bill for thousands of dollars.
Right.
Not to mention, like you had said, blood work afterward. I had to do that for several weeks. Doctor visits. That was just 3 hours in a room.
Right. I, in some ways, paying the like $93 or $97 bill for after my second miscarriage was like more painful than like showing up with $500, which this is just me. Other people might find it different, but like what you said, like you're starting to sort of be okay. So like that week I was just sort of in the twilight zone. Nothing felt real. Nothing felt the week that I had surgery. Nothing felt real. Nothing felt normal. Everything felt like the twilight zone. So I just wasn't even like capable of feeling that. And again, with the privilege that I wasn't worried about groceries the next week either. But that $93 bill, it came like 6 to 8 weeks after. I was kind of okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember it was like a decent sunny, maybe November day. And I I went to lunch with my husband that day, and I was also just mad.
Yeah.
Like,
it's like you understand that there are obviously medical fees, right?
Right. Those are not unjust.
It's not, it's all part of it. But also I was not expecting, I guess, that amount. But how would I know?
Well, and I think,
or how do women know, really?
Right. And I think that, they're medical fees. I never dispute that they're inherently unjust or argue that they're unjust.
Sure.
There's almost no medical fees except for the delivery of my baby that I'm like, woohoo, that was so happy.
Yeah.
Like, I understand that it costs money and that nurses and doctors need paid and facilities need built. And I never want to dispute that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not qualified to dispute insurance and medical costs. I have no idea. But the basic principle that we should pay in the system we have, that
Mm-hmm.
if you have an ultrasound or a surgery, yes, your anesthesiologist needs paid.
Mm-hmm.
I don't dispute that.
Right.
But I think there's an awareness we have to have that this can be, I don't think we realize how much of a financial burden this can be. When someone has cancer, people start GoFundMes right away.
Yeah.
Because cancer's expensive.
Yes.
And
And miscarriage is expensive.
miscarriage is expensive too. And, and what's hard, okay, so my husband had cancer
Mm.
and our bills were very high, but also they weren't. We had a deductible, but people supported us and gave us, and we needed that financial support. And I don't want to, the financial burden of cancer was quote unquote greater.
Mm.
But again, cancer costs money, miscarriage costs money, broken legs cost money. They all cost money.
Mm-hmm.
But there's something about the miscarriage bills that just like, also my husband was healed from cancer, right? Like I paid them for a product
It's
that I am
like-
glad to have.
It's like paying for a death.
Yeah.
That's what it feels like. It's just, yeah, like you said, it's terrible.
And I
It's
think
heartbreaking.
it is such an interesting common, I just keep, whenever it gets brought up, it doesn't get brought up often, but when it does get brought up, every woman is like, oh yeah, that was horrible. The worst
Yeah.
bill I ever paid.
Right. It is. It's probably my worst bill I've ever paid.
Yeah.
It
And-
is. I know that for a fact.
Yeah. You just, and then add on medical bills can bury people quickly.
Yes.
And that buying groceries and having other children and paying rent or mortgages
Mhm.
or, and if you have, like we said, miscarriages are often non-medical events, can be very early miscarriages. But the risks associated, hemorrhaging,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely needs to be a trip to the ER.
Yes.
It just keeps piling up. And I know some women who've sort of like, you start to miscarry at home and then you like hemorrhage and then you
Ugh.
have like a DNC and an, you
Mhm.
end up having,
Like they're trying to like see what would happen
Right.
before.
yeah, and you or
Making
you
that
didn't
decision.
know, and you end up just having like cascading costs and you end up paying for all of it. And yeah, it's a difficult, really difficult reality. So, and it's actually the reality that it was that bill that morning, the $93 or $97 bill, that I was like, if I could just make these go away, I just start calling hospitals and paying for them. And my husband reminded me we don't have all the money in the world at all. So I couldn't do that. But that's what I think one of those first seeds, there were multiple seeds that led us to be EPLA, but that was one of those first ones. And I started talking to other women just with similar stories and with good insurance, racking up
Right.
$9,500 bills.
Yeah. It's crazy.
So, like you said, $2,000 and you ended up miscarrying at home.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then you have your follow-up appointments and follow-up blood work. And no, I think by the time it was all said and done, I mean, we were probably close to 3,000
Yeah.
in 2012. Who knows what it would be today? I don't know.
Right. And this article I found is from 2022. I was careful to make sure to find something new. I do think it's interesting, though, all around this time we're talking, I found a Slate article from 2015. There's some early stuff out there from about 10 years ago where people started, and I'm not sure that it's gotten, better. It's probably gotten worse.
I assume.
As healthcare charges have gotten worse. One thing we look at too in Hillsdale County, which we have great access here to OBGYNs and a labor and delivery unit. But one of the rural health crises are labor and delivery units leaving counties like ours. And so then you either have to go to the ER or you have to drive a long way to get OB care. But there are some deserts for prenatal care that exist.
Yes.
Which just compounds the financial burden. And we drove my first pregnancy in Michigan. We were in Marshall. We drove an hour like every day, for appointments and ultrasounds. And
We did the same thing. We drove a little over an hour.
yeah. And so those are costs
Yeah.
of gas and of lunch and we were doing that frequently. And we live in a small town where our gas budget can be very small. That was not a budgeted expense.
Yeah.
We don't drive very far.
Yeah.
Most days.
We're lucky.
Yes, it's very nice. But that wasn't a budgeted expense. And so I know that has only continued to get worse. And we're lucky here in our community that women have access to medical care.
Yeah, absolutely. That is something that I'm also very grateful for.
Yeah. So, but it's huge. So we just launched our medical bill relief program in October, which is a local program currently with the Hillsdale Hospital, where we provide up to $500 for out-of-pocket expenses upon request. And the information is given to women at the time of diagnosis for all miscarriage-related expenses, which would include, ER visit, ultrasounds, ambulance ride. But looking at these prices, I mean, $500 is a lot. $500 is helpful. $500 doesn't even touch it.
But it's also very comforting. Like that would have been a very comforting thing to feel like if I were to receive that.
Right.
I mean, that's a great, loving, caring gift for a mom.
Right. And so I would love to see a world where we could pay all of the bills.
Right. Yes.
And these programs start everywhere. It doesn't even have to be by us. This is something I would just love to see, sort of in the way we have a culture that, like, with other medical diagnoses, families and friends rally. I think it's important too I'm excited about what we're doing, but I think it's important too for churches and for communities to know that this is very expensive. I think sometimes churches don't know what to do.
And think of it more as an emotional and physical, I don't know if I'm saying that right, maybe more of a physical experience.
Right.
Not thinking like beyond what comes after.
Right. And this is one of those things that, depending on your community and the availability, but that realizing, like, no, this is going to be an emotional and physical and financial and spiritual burden.
Oh, yes.
And if it's either appropriate for the church themselves, if that's a way they minister to their families, or if it's appropriate for fundraisers, and work with the family on what they're comfortable with. But that's one of the questions to ask, or one of the things to just assume that, no, we understand that this can be an expensive process, and we want to offer you this gift. Any sort of community can do that.
Right.
So I really encourage other people to realize.
And that's kind of been one of our missions, right? To reach out to our community, our local churches, things of that nature.
Yeah. Yeah. I think while we're talking about the awareness, we want to help others help others.
Mm-hmm.
We're not in this alone, and way more is going to get done. I think one of the interesting things about awareness, back to this article we were reading, Erin Schultz in this article, she was a personal finance expert
Mm.
and says that she was unprepared for the high cost of miscarriage.
Mm.
And she just didn't know, didn't assume. So it's still not a well talked about.
No, it's not.
Talking about financial need is not.
It's very
always
personal.
easy. Yeah.
It's a very personal subject, I feel like, because for us, I remember setting up a payment plan. I don't know, for so many years. I remember when that last bill was paid off. I think I did a 2-year payment plan. I don't know.
Wow. Yeah.
So it was like, praise God that now this is officially, like, I feel like I have completed everything. Like, it was just
behind
like
you,
drawn out process.
Right. And I think if you choose to bury, if you choose, and it's not something, we have life insurance on our loved ones, on ourselves. Some people prepay their funerals. It's not something that is unfortunately expensive. It's not something you think about. And it also, like we've talked about, sometimes happens young, sometimes happens older. But if you're young, you may not have a good, healthy emergency plan. If you're older, you may be so, I look at us on the other side now where we have kids and houses and school and cars.
All the things.
So
food.
many things to pay for. So it's never easy. And then one last thing is, she talks about like fertility treatments. If the testing comes back and says, that's where those expenses can sort of like linger on. I did extra progesterone with my 2 live births because, or with my 1, I didn't with the second, but like there were extra things I had to do because of my history of miscarriage. I'm still managing my thyroid because of my history of miscarriage, so like, and not that caused that. It's just that my miscarriage led us to some thyroid things, but like we address pregnancies different because of my history of miscarriage. And we were lucky that there wasn't some surgical need to, that all of my anatomy was okay and all of our blood work was okay. But there's cascading. I have extra doctor appointments because of my history of miscarriage,
Right. Yes.
So I get 8-week ultrasounds or 6-week ultrasound. I get in earlier than depending on the provider. But so there's all of these things that I still.
Yeah. It's just like a continuous, I don't know, just seems to sometimes never end, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And for some families, it's even more. We've been lucky that it's sort of those, it sort of solved itself with the simple, thyroid treatment is not super expensive, but sometimes there's really expensive options out there. So
I just think bringing awareness to this topic is so important because miscarriage, like I said, it's more than the emotional, physical, it's also financial, and just important to reach out to those who might be.
Well, and financial burdens can cause emotional and spiritual burdens.
Yes, spiritual as well.
And most common marriage fight, right? Can be finances can they're just can destroy a marriage from the inside out, and that financial burden can affect everything. And so I think it's really important that we keep talking about it. I would love our listeners to share any story. Either you want to share about your own story. We always need blog posts. I think that's one way we can raise awareness. Anything you're willing to share, the more we get it out there. Also, I'd love to hear any ideas and ways that we can continue to help families in this way, or any ways that others can continue to help families. So we would love to hear from you. You can always email us at miscarriagecare@gmail.com or leave some comments. But we're very glad. We're very glad you're listening.
Yes.
And we're share this podcast right now. I think this is just sort of rally cry. continuing rally cry for awareness and for families that it can be an ongoing burden.
Thank you for listening to Hope Blooms, a podcast from the Early Pregnancy Loss Association.
To learn more about how we and you can support women suffering early pregnancy loss, visit our website at miscarriagecare.com or find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you for listening.